In this video, I'm going to make the instrument cluster work on this, my early BMW E30. And I'm going to do that by bypassing the service indicator board. But to do that, I'm going to have to seriously up my soldering game. Confession time. Up to now, I've always been rubbish at soldering. My past attempts have looked messy and fragile, and I've always been afraid that I'll melt every bit of componentry in a 50-yard radius as I stab away in frustration with the hot soldering iron. When it comes to electronics, I'm strictly a software guy, and on the cars I can usually get by with just using crimp connectors anyway. But now I need to fix the instrument cluster electronics on my BMW E30, and replacements are very rare and very expensive, so I'm going to have to face down my electronics demons and learn to solder properly. When BMW launched the E28 5 Series back in 1981, it introduced a clever new gadget, a service indicator. This is a little row of LED lights, green, then amber, and finally red, which tells you when your ultimate driving machine is due for some attention from the dealer. Variable service intervals are pretty ubiquitous on modern cars these days, but this was radical tech in the early 1980s because it wasn't just based on mileage, but calculated engine wear based on all sorts of other inputs too, like temperature, revs, and so on. The ECU takes feeds from all the various sensors, does some maths, and holds in memory its opinion of how ultimate your driving has been since the last time the dealer reset the system. 40 years on, there's the problem right there. Holding data in memory requires continuous power, or at least it did in the days before solid-state SD card type memory. So the service indicator board has its own long-life rechargeable batteries, like these ones. If the car's laid up for a while, as mine was a couple of years ago, then those batteries go flat, and of course that means they then start to leak acid onto the printed circuit board. Not good. The service computer is fitted in series with the instruments, as far as I can make out, at least partly. So when the service indicator PCB gets damaged, not only does the little computer stop working, but so do things like the temperature gauge, because the feeds don't go out properly. And as anyone who's driven an old car in modern traffic will readily testify, the temperature gauge is really not the thing you'd pick to give the day off. The first job is to take the instruments out. Luckily, this is an old car from the days when maintenance was still a thing, so it's just a question of removing some discrete screws rather than demolishing the entire fascia and snapping 437 plastic clips. There are a couple of thumb wheels too, which are quite handy. You don't need to worry about how to get a screwdriver in there, although you do need slightly bionic fingers. Interestingly, for something of this vintage, the cluster is connected to the car just by these two plug-in connectors. All the gauges are electronic, so there's no speedo cable or anything like that. This car was the future, once. Where I was going wrong with soldering was to apply flux to the things I wanted to solder, then waving a stick of solder at them and the soldering iron and hoping some of the magic metal would stick to both of them at once. It doesn't work very well, and it doesn't work very often, but that's because it's not the right way to do it. The right way is actually a great deal easier. What you do is apply some flux and some solder to each of the two things you want to join together in turn, like this, and then this, and then you can unite them together, kind of pre-soldered, add a bit more flux, and then a touch with a hot soldering iron will melt it all neatly into one unified thing. Voila! Back to the actual cluster. I trained mine to dismantle itself, but you can just use a screwdriver. For the repair, I've got two priorities. Number one is to get these batteries out so that they don't leak any more acid over the precious innards of my car. They're held in with all this rubbery resin compound too, and they're actually spot welded in place as well. You can drill out the tiny spot welds with a hand drill or a Dremel like I did, and I found that that was also an effective way to scoop up some of the resin gunk as well, because it kind of melted it and then it would wind itself around the drill bit. Obviously you'll have to be quite careful here not to savage any of the other components while you're poking about with a whirring drill. And if yours is a different sort of resin, the kind of hard set stuff, then you'll probably have to come up with a different solution. But I'll leave you that problem to solve yourself. Number 2 priority is to make the gauges work again, and that's where the soldering comes in. A fair bit of digging around threw up a site called E30’s.com, which unsurprisingly specialises in selling various parts for these, but will also do you a PDF workshop manual. That told me that I needed to connect this second terminal in the right-hand block with the 5th terminal. By the way, it's worth saying this cluster is the kind fitted to early E30s like mine, from 1983 to 87. Later ones are different. Happily, the E30clusters.com repair manual covers both. You can tell the later ones as they have smaller lithium batteries and just the one red LED to say I need a service, instead of this one's 3 to say I need a service, I really, really need a service, and some people just don't deserve nice things. Anyway, the moment of truth. Flux on the terminals, which I've marked with a pen so I don't panic and wire up the wrong ones. Then tin the terminals with a bit of solder. Flux on the joining wire and tin both ends of the wire as well. Hold it in place, brief touch with the point of the iron, and lo, a neat and strong solder joint. Well, neat and strong-ish. That first one is a bit iffy, so I'll tin the iron again and give it a touch more. There we go. Fear of soldering conquered. You can actually buy replacement batteries. They're still used sometimes in industrial applications, but there's a BMW emporium in the Netherlands called Tim's Classic Car Parts that will sell them to you retail. I'll put a link down in the description in case you want some. They sell various bits for 70s and 80s BMWs anyway. In my case, this board is too badly damaged to expect it to work again, so I'm resigned to life without a service indicator. But that's fine, given that oil changes and so on will fall due based on time rather than mileage or wear in any case, given the kind of usage that this car gets, although I do use it as my main daily runabout. As you can see, reassembling everything is basically just the reverse of removal, as the good Professor Haynes always says in his manuals. My PDF repair manual for this cluster says to leave the service indicator board out after you've bridged the terminals, which sort of makes sense, but I did a test run like that and nothing worked. So I put it back in, and now I have a working temperature gauge, and a fuel gauge, and a speedometer, and all the warning lights as far as I can tell, without having caused them all to go off. I'm missing one warning light here, which I believe is the it's the temperature warning light, which is probably not ideal, but there we are. What I still don't have is a working rev counter, or that economy meter thing, which is actually quite annoying, so I don't mind that, or the mileometer. I would like to fix those, but that will have to wait until another video. I'll put a link up here when I've made that. Meanwhile, I'm so excited about my skills that I'm off to look for something else that needs soldering. Happy New Year!